The small town of San Mirasol rested quietly beneath the crescent moon, its silhouette framed by the jagged hills that loomed like silent sentinels. Known for its tranquil nights and pastoral charm, it was the kind of place where people rarely locked their doors. But lately, unease had crept in like a whisper, coiling itself around the hearts of the townsfolk. Something was wrong. The first whispers began with the ranchers. One morning, a farmer named Carlos Alvarez found his prize guna lying motionless in the pen. Her body was drained of blood, her neck punctured by two deep circular wounds. At first, Carlos assumed it was a predator, a wolf, or maybe a large feral dog. But as days turned into weeks, more animals fell victim. Chickens, sheep, even a cow, all discovered lifeless with those same telltale marks. Strangely, there was no sign of a struggle, no trail of blood leading away from the bodies. Whatever had done this had left no tracks, no trace. San Mirasol, already a town of wary superstition, buzzed with theories. Some whispered about rogue coyotes, others blamed something darker, something unspoken. A name was murmured in hushed tones, El Chupacabra. For years, it had been nothing more than a legend shared around campfires, a story to scare children into staying close to home. But now, in the face of inexplicable carnage, the legend had taken root in their minds. When the news broke on a local radio station, it spread like wildfire. Journalists from neighboring towns descended on San Mirasol, hoping to catch a whiff of the strange. Among them was Elena Reyes, a seasoned reporter from the city, eager to dismiss the tales of monsters as rural hysteria. She had heard it all before: aliens in the desert, witches in the woods. But something about this story intrigued her. The reports were consistent, the fear tangible. People were genuinely convinced that something unnatural was stalking their town. Elena arrived just after sunset, her car bouncing along the dirt road that led into San Mirasol. The air was thick with the scent of earth and sagebrush, and in the distance, coyotes howled mournfully. The town itself was eerily quiet. Windows were shuttered and streetlights flickered weakly. At the local inn where she checked in, the receptionist, a wiry man with a nervous smile, urged her not to go out after dark. "Why not?" Elena asked, amused by his earnestness. The man hesitated, his eyes darting toward the window. "It's better you don't," he said finally. "Not until this thing passes." Elena shrugged it off as local superstition, but as she settled into her room, unease prickled at her. The town's atmosphere felt heavy, as though it were holding its breath. She couldn't help but think of the ranchers' stories of animals drained dry and punctured with wounds too precise to be natural. Her first night in San Mirasol was restless. Outside, the wind moaned through the hills, carrying with it a strange, guttural cry that made her bolt upright in bed. For a moment, she thought she saw a shadow move across her window, but when she drew the curtains, there was nothing there, just the empty street and the dim glow of the moon. It was only the beginning. Something in San Mirasol was wrong, and whatever it was, it felt closer than Elena cared to admit. Elena spent the remainder of the day in restless preparation. Her notes were spread across the small desk in her room, a chaotic mix of eyewitness accounts, crude sketches of the supposed creature, and the unsettling details she'd gathered. Each thread seemed to lead nowhere, looping back to the same impossible conclusion. Whatever was responsible for these attacks was unlike anything natural. She couldn't shake the sound she'd heard the previous night, that haunting cry carried on the wind. It played on repeat in her mind, a discordant melody that seemed both animalistic and unnatural. Her instincts as a journalist told her it was just an animal call amplified by fear, but her gut told her something else entirely, something she wasn't ready to admit. By late afternoon, the sun was dipping low in the sky, its orange glow painting the hills with a surreal warmth that felt at odds with the growing tension. Elena had arranged to meet one of the ranchers, an older man named Tomas Gutierrez, who claimed to have seen something unusual weeks before the attacks began. His home was on the outskirts of San Mirasol, a modest adobe structure surrounded by dusty fields. Tomas greeted her on the porch, his face weathered by years of hard labor and sun. His eyes, though kind, carried a weight that spoke of sleepless nights and a burden he hadn't shared. He waved her inside without a word, leading her to a simple kitchen where the scent of strong coffee lingered. A rosary hung from the wall, its beads worn smooth from frequent use. "You said you saw something, Mr. Gutierrez," Elena began, settling into a wooden chair. "I'd like to know what it was." Tomas hesitated, pouring himself a mug of coffee before speaking. "I don't know what I saw," he admitted, his voice low and deliberate. "But it wasn't like anything I've seen before. It wasn't natural." He described a shadowy figure he'd spotted near his property late one night, moving with a speed and grace that defied explanation. At first, he'd thought it was a large dog or a coyote, but its movements were too calculated, too deliberate. It had paused near his chicken coop, and Thomas swore he saw eyes that glinted red in the moonlight before it vanished into the darkness. "I stayed up after that," he said, gripping the edge of the table. "Sat by the window with my shotgun, waiting for it to come back. But it didn't. At least not that I could see." Elena pressed him for more details, but Tomas shook his head, unwilling or unable to elaborate. "I've lived here my whole life," he said finally. "I've hunted in those hills, camped out under the stars. I know every sound, every animal, every shadow out there. But this, whatever it is, it's not from here." The conviction in his voice sent a shiver down Elena's spine. She'd heard similar sentiments from others in the town, but coming from Tomas, it felt more grounded, less like superstition and more like fact. As she left his home, the sun had almost disappeared, and the hills were bathed in an eerie twilight. Tomas had warned her to head back to town before nightfall, but something compelled her to linger. She stood by her car, staring out at the rolling expanse of land, her camera slung over her shoulder. The air was still, heavy with anticipation, and for a moment, Elena felt like the world itself was holding its breath. Then, in the distance, a faint rustling broke the silence. Her pulse quickened as she strained to see through the encroaching darkness. The sound grew louder, closer, but whatever was causing it remained hidden. She lifted her camera, pointing it toward the noise, but as the flash lit up the field, there was nothing there, just empty space and the growing night. Unease settled over her like a shroud. Whatever was out there was playing a game, and it was getting closer. Elena's hands trembled slightly as she lowered the camera. The empty flash had illuminated nothing but barren grass and scattered rocks. Yet the sound, that rustling, almost deliberate, persisted, moving just beyond the edges of visibility. It circled her, staying always out of reach, as if taunting her. She took a step back toward her car, her heart pounding so loudly it seemed to echo in her ears. With each rustle, her pulse quickened, and her breaths came shorter. Elena wasn't easily spooked. Years of investigative reporting had hardened her nerves, but this was different. There was a presence, unseen but palpable, brushing against her senses like an icy wind. Her flashlight flickered as she swung its beam across the field. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice carrying across the vast expanse. The only response was the rustling, sharper now, accompanied by an almost imperceptible growl. It was low and guttural, just enough to send a chill down her spine. Then silence. The sudden absence of noise was somehow worse. Elena scanned the area again, her flashlight cutting through the encroaching darkness. The stillness pressed down on her, heavy and oppressive, until her instincts screamed for her to move. She turned on her heel, fumbling with the car door handle. Her hand slipped once, twice, before she finally yanked it open and slid inside. Slamming the door shut, she locked it and gripped the steering wheel, trying to calm her breathing. As she sat there, staring out at the now still field, her rational mind fought to regain control. It was just an animal, she told herself, maybe a coyote or a stray dog. Animals could be curious, even bold, especially at night. But deep down, she knew this explanation didn't fit. The sounds, the deliberate way they had circled her, were too intelligent, too calculated. Elena started the engine, and the headlights cut through the gloom, illuminating the field once more. For a split second, she thought she saw movement, a fleeting shadow at the edge of the light. But when she looked again, it was gone. Shaking her head, she pressed on the accelerator and drove back toward town, the dark road winding like a serpent through the hills. When she arrived at the inn, the receptionist was gone, and the lobby was eerily quiet. Elena hurried up to her room, locking the door behind her. She leaned against it for a moment, letting the tension drain from her body. Her mind replayed the scene in the field, trying to piece together what she had experienced. Fear and curiosity warred within her, each fueling the other. Sitting at the desk, she began scribbling notes, trying to capture every detail before it faded. The sound, The growl, the flicker of movement. Each memory felt sharper, more vivid, as she wrote. But no matter how hard she tried to rationalize it, a gnawing sense of unease remained. Something was out there and it wasn't finished. As the hours passed and the small clock on the nightstand ticked into the early morning, Elena forced herself to review her research. The townspeople's stories, the accounts of livestock deaths, Tomas's unsettling conviction, it all painted a picture of something far beyond the ordinary. Her skepticism was beginning to crack, replaced by a nagging realization that she couldn't ignore. Suddenly, a soft sound broke her concentration, a faint tapping at the window. She froze, her pen hovering above the paper. The tapping came again, slow and deliberate, like fingernails brushing against glass. Her pulse quickened as she turned her head, staring at the dark pane. The curtains swayed slightly, though the window was shut tight. Gathering her courage, Elena reached for the flashlight and stood, her steps hesitant as she approached the glass. She pulled the curtain aside in one swift motion, shining the light into the darkness beyond. Nothing, just the reflection of her own pale face staring back at her. But as she lowered the flashlight, she noticed something in the condensation on the glass. Two small, perfectly round marks side by side. Her breath hitched and she staggered back, the flashlight slipping from her grip. The marks glistened faintly, and though they were just impressions in the glass, they carried a weight that crushed any lingering doubts. Something had been there, and it knew she was watching. Elena sat frozen on the edge of her bed, her gaze fixed on the window. The faint, circular impressions on the glass glimmered softly in the dim light, their presence both undeniable and inexplicable. She struggled to control her breathing, her thoughts racing as she replayed the events of the night. Every instinct screamed at her to leave San Mirasol, to pack her things and drive until the strange, suffocating atmosphere of the town was nothing but a distant memory. But she couldn't leave. Not yet. Gripping the flashlight tighter, she forced herself to approach the window again. She pressed her hand against the glass, feeling its cold surface, her own faint fingerprints overlapping with the marks left behind. The impression seemed almost deliberate, as though left there for her to see. Were they made by claws? Fingertips? Teeth? She couldn't tell, but the precision of their shape sent a fresh wave of unease through her. Her phone vibrated on the desk, breaking the silence. Elena jumped, startled, before snatching it up. The screen displayed an unfamiliar number, but she answered anyway, her voice trembling slightly as she said, "Hello? Elena Reyes?" The voice on the other end was low and gravelly, like someone unused to speaking. "You don't know me, but I know why you're here." Her heart skipped a beat. "Who is this?" The caller ignored the question. "You're in danger. You've seen it, haven't you? Or at least, you've felt it. It knows you're here now." Elena's grip tightened on the phone. "Who are you?" she demanded again, her voice rising. "What do you know about what's happening here?" A brief pause, and then the voice softened as if trying to calm her. "You're looking for answers, but you're digging in the wrong places. This thing, it's not just a story. It's older than the town, older than any of us, and it doesn't like to be hunted." "Why are you telling me this?" Elena asked, pacing the small room. "If you know something, then tell me. What is it?" Another pause, longer this time, before the voice spoke again. "Come to the old church at sunrise. I'll explain everything I can, but be careful. You're not safe tonight." The line went dead. Elena stared at the phone in disbelief, her thoughts churning. The old church? She'd passed it on her way into town, a crumbling, abandoned structure on a hill that seemed forgotten by time. The rational part of her screamed that this could be a trap, that she was being lured into something far worse than what she'd already encountered. But the journalist in her was drawn to the promise of answers, no matter the risk. She sat back down, running a hand through her hair. The town was silent now, the only sound the faint ticking of the clock on the nightstand. The room suddenly felt smaller, suffocating, as though the very walls were closing in. She glanced back at the window. The marks were still there, faint but unmistakable. Elena knew she wouldn't sleep. She wouldn't even try. Instead, she began to prepare, gathering her camera, flashlight, and a small pocket knife she carried out of habit. If she was going to the old church, she wasn't going unprepared. The hours crawled by, each one stretching longer than the last. Outside, the wind howled, rattling the loose shutters of the inn. Every creak, every groan of the old building set her nerves on edge. She kept glancing at the window, half expecting to see those glowing eyes Thomas had described. Finally, as the first rays of dawn began to creep over the horizon, Elena stood, her resolve hardened. Whatever was happening in San Mirasol, it wasn't just a story. And if the caller was right, she was already a part of it. She had to know the truth. The journey to the old church was eerily quiet. Elena drove her car down the empty dirt road, the early morning light casting long shadows across the barren landscape. The town of San Mirasol seemed lifeless in the dawn haze, as though its inhabitants were hiding from something unseen. She gripped the steering wheel tightly, her eyes flicking to the rearview mirror every few seconds, half expecting to see a shadowy figure following her. The church appeared as she crested a small hill, its silhouette stark against the golden sky. It was a crumbling structure of weathered stone and splintered wood, its roof partially caved in. Ivy clung to its walls like veins, and the bell tower, though leaning, still stood as a sentinel over the surrounding land. Something about the building exuded a quiet menace, a sense that it had witnessed too much. Elena parked the car and stepped out, the chill of the early morning air biting against her skin. Her camera hung around her neck, and the pocket knife was tucked securely into her jacket. As she approached the church, the crunch of her boots on the gravel path seemed unnaturally loud. She reached the heavy wooden doors, one of which hung ajar, and pushed it open with a creak that echoed through the hollow interior. The inside was dim, the stained glass windows coated with grime that dulled the sunlight. Rows of broken pews stretched toward an altar draped in tattered cloth. The air smelled of mildew and decay, and a faint breeze whispered through the cracks in the walls. "Elena," a voice called softly, startling her. She spun around to see a man emerge from the shadows near the altar. He was older, his face gaunt and weathered, with eyes that seemed to hold the weight of too many secrets. He wore a tattered jacket and a wide-brimmed hat that cast his face in partial shadow. His hands were clasped in front of him, and his posture was tense, as if bracing for something. "You're the one who called me," Elena said, her voice steady despite the knot of anxiety tightening in her chest. The man nodded. "Name's Matteo," he said simply, "and I didn't call you to scare you. I called you to warn you." Elena stepped closer, her eyes narrowing. "Warn me about what? What is this thing? And why is it killing animals, terrorizing this town?" Matteo gestured for her to sit on one of the less broken pews. She hesitated before perching on the edge, her notebook ready in her lap. He remained standing, his gaze fixed on the cracked floor as he spoke. "It's not an animal," he began. "Not in the way you think. It's older than this town, older than the hills themselves. Some say it's a curse, something left behind by people who lived here long before us. Others think it's something worse." "Worse?" Elena pressed. "Like what?" Matteo sighed, removing his hat and running a hand through his graying hair. "There are stories. Stories of things from the sky, things that don't belong here, things that were abandoned or escaped." Elena frowned. "You're talking about aliens?" He shook his head. "Not aliens, not exactly. Whatever it is, it doesn't follow the rules of this world. It's intelligent, patient, and it knows how to make you doubt what you've seen." She leaned forward, her pen hovering over the page. "And you've seen it?" Matteo hesitated, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Not just seen it, I've felt it, watched it. It doesn't just kill, it studies you, learns you, and when it decides you're a threat." He didn't finish, but the silence that followed spoke louder than words. Elena's grip tightened on her pen. "Then why help me? Why risk bringing me here?" Matteo finally met her gaze, his expression grave. "Because you're already involved. And once it knows you, there's no turning back." Before Elena could respond, the faint sound of rustling drifted in from outside the church. Both of them froze, their eyes snapping toward the broken windows. The sound grew louder, closer, accompanied by an eerie, guttural growl that sent a shiver through her bones. "It's here," Matteo whispered. Elena's breath caught as the low growl reverberated through the hollow church, resonating like an unspoken threat in the still air. She glanced at Matteo, whose expression had hardened into a mask of grim determination. His hand moved to his jacket, pulling out an old, worn revolver. The metal glinted faintly in the dim light, its presence both reassuring and ominous. "Stay quiet," Matteo hissed, his voice barely audible. And don't move. Elena gripped her camera, her fingers trembling as her mind raced. Was this the moment she'd been chasing? The culmination of every strange tale, every whispered warning? The part of her that craved the truth was at war with the primal instinct to flee. The rustling grew louder, now unmistakably close. It wasn't the random noise of wind or an animal moving aimlessly. It was deliberate, calculated, circling the church like a predator sizing up its prey. Through one of the broken windows, Elena thought she saw movement, a blur of shadow against shadow. Her heart pounded in her chest as she strained to focus, but the figure remained elusive, always just out of view. Mateo gestured silently toward the altar, signaling her to move behind it. Elena hesitated for a fraction of a second before nodding, her footsteps as quiet as possible on the creaking wooden floor. She crouched behind the crumbling stone structure, her body pressed against the cool surface. From her vantage point, she could see Mateo standing in the open, his stance steady despite the growing tension. The growl came again, deeper this time, vibrating through the very walls of the church. Then, silence. A long, agonizing silence that stretched on until Elena felt as though her own heartbeat was the loudest sound in the room. And then it struck. The window near the altar shattered inward, shards of glass scattering like deadly rain. Elena flinched, her instincts screaming at her to run, but she held her ground. Mateo raised his revolver, aiming toward the dark figure now partially visible in the broken window. It was low to the ground, its form hunched and unnatural. Elena's eyes widened as she caught glimpses of its features, gleaming eyes that seemed to absorb the light, and a form that defied reason, shifting as if it were not bound by the laws of flesh and bone. Mateo fired. The deafening crack of the gunshot shattered the stillness, followed by a high-pitched screech that sent Elena's pulse racing. The creature recoiled, disappearing into the shadows outside, but the sense of relief was fleeting. The rustling resumed, this time from multiple directions, as if the entity was no longer alone. "They never come alone," Mateo muttered under his breath, reloading the revolver with shaking hands. He glanced at Elena, his voice sharp and urgent. "If you've got a plan, now's the time." Elena forced herself to think, her journalistic instincts struggling to rise above her terror. "You said it's intelligent," she whispered. "It's watching us, learning. What does it want?" Mateo shook his head. "Survival, or maybe something worse. It doesn't matter. It won't stop." The church groaned as something heavy landed on the roof, the sound reverberating through the structure. Dust rained down from the rafters, and Elena's stomach turned as she realized how precarious their situation had become. She grabbed her flashlight, pointing it toward the ceiling, but saw nothing except the warped wooden beams. "Can we make it to the car?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Mateo hesitated, his gaze darting toward the shattered window. "We can try, but it'll see us coming. They always see." The growling returned, surrounding the church now, a chorus of guttural noises that filled the space with an almost tangible dread. Elena clenched her fists, her mind racing. Whatever these things were, they weren't just beasts. They were hunters. And she and Mateo were the prey. The church seemed to close in around them, the walls groaning under the weight of the unseen presence outside. Elena's resolve hardened. She wasn't leaving without the truth, but she wasn't going to die for it either. "We need a distraction," she whispered, her voice steady now. "Something to draw them away." Mateo's grim expression softened just enough to reveal a spark of admiration. "You've got guts," he said, pulling a worn lighter from his pocket. "Let's see if that works on them." Before she could ask what he meant, he lit a small piece of cloth and tossed it toward the broken window. The flame caught quickly, illuminating the church's interior and casting flickering shadows that danced across the walls. For a moment, the growls faltered, replaced by an eerie silence. Then the chaos began. The fire Mateo had started crackled loudly, its flickering light casting erratic shadows across the ruined church. For a moment, the growls outside seemed to retreat, replaced by a tense, almost unbearable silence. Elena crouched lower behind the altar, her heart pounding so violently she thought it might give her away. Mateo remained in the center of the room, his revolver raised, eyes darting between the broken windows and the still-burning cloth. "They're watching," Mateo muttered, his voice tight with both fear and focus, "trying to figure out what we'll do next." Elena felt the weight of the truth in his words. Whatever these things were, they weren't acting on instinct alone. They were calculating, adapting. She swallowed hard and whispered, "How do we outthink something like that?" Mateo didn't answer, but his grip on the revolver tightened. Suddenly, the creature struck again. This time, it came from above. With a deafening crash, the rotting ceiling beam splintered, raining debris onto the church floor. Elena screamed as a massive shadow plummeted through the hole, landing in the center of the room with an almost predatory grace. It crouched low, its glowing eyes fixed on Mateo. For the first time, Elena saw the creature clearly. It was larger than she had imagined, its body unnaturally lean and sinewy, covered in a dark, matted hide. Its limbs were grotesquely elongated, and its mouth, if that's what it could be called, was lined with needle-like teeth, bared in a snarl that seemed almost human in its fury. Mateo fired without hesitation. The gunshot echoed deafeningly in the confined space, and the creature recoiled, a sharp, keening wail erupting from its throat. But it didn't fall. Instead, it lunged forward, faster than seemed possible, its clawed hands swiping at Mateo. He barely dodged, the tips of its claws slicing through the sleeve of his jacket. Elena's paralysis broke. Adrenaline surged through her veins as she grabbed her flashlight and aimed it at the creature, clicking it on with a burst of light. The beam struck the creature's face, and it shrieked, stumbling backward and shielding its eyes. Its reaction was instant and violent, as though the light itself burned its flesh. "They hate the light," Elena shouted, scrambling to her feet. She pointed the flashlight toward the broken windows, sweeping it in wide arcs. The rustling outside grew frantic, and she realized the other creatures were retreating from the illumination spilling out of the church. Mateo caught on quickly. "Keep it on them," he barked, pulling a flare from his pocket. He struck it against the floor, and a vivid red glow erupted, filling the church with harsh, crimson light. The creature snarled, retreating into the shadows, its movements jittery and erratic. "We need to move now," Mateo shouted, tossing the flare into the center of the room to keep the area lit. He grabbed Elena's arm, pulling her toward the door. She didn't resist, clutching her flashlight tightly as they darted out of the church and into the open air. Outside, the dawn was breaking, the first rays of sunlight spreading across the horizon, but the creatures weren't gone. They lurked at the edges of the light, their forms shifting and blending into the shadows of the trees and rocks. "Get to the car," Mateo yelled, firing another shot to keep them at bay. Elena sprinted ahead, her legs screaming with the effort, her mind racing with the realization that they might not make it. As she reached the car, she fumbled with the keys, her hands shaking uncontrollably. Mateo was only a few steps behind her, his revolver empty but still raised as if willing it to fire again. The growls grew louder, closer, as the creatures pressed against the limits of the light, testing the boundaries. Finally, Elena managed to unlock the door. She and Mateo dove inside, slamming the door shut just as the creatures surged forward. She started the engine, the headlights flaring to life and bathing the area in harsh, artificial light. The creatures recoiled once more, their forms twisting unnaturally as they retreated into the shadows. Elena didn't wait. She hit the accelerator, the tires kicking up gravel as the car sped away from the church. The road ahead was uneven and narrow, but she didn't care. All that mattered was putting distance between them and whatever had just tried to kill them. Beside her, Mateo was breathing heavily, his revolver resting uselessly in his lap. "They're not going to stop," he said grimly. "They never do." Elena tightened her grip on the wheel, her mind already racing toward the next question. What were they, and why were they here? The answers felt closer than ever, but so did the danger, and something told her this was far from over. The tires screeched as Elena swerved onto the main road, her pulse still pounding from the encounter at the church. Mateo sat silently beside her, his revolver resting in his lap, his face grim. Every few seconds, his eyes flicked to the side mirror, scanning the landscape for any signs of movement. Elena felt the tension radiating off him, and it only fueled her own growing anxiety. "They didn't follow," she said after several miles of silence, glancing in the rearview mirror herself. The road behind them was empty, the first light of dawn painting the sky in pale streaks of pink and gold. "At least, not yet." "They will," Mateo muttered, his voice low and rough. They always wait. They let you think you're safe until you're not. Elena tightened her grip on the wheel, her knuckles white against the leather. What do you mean? They always. How long have you been dealing with this? Mateo hesitated, his jaw tightening twice, long enough to know it doesn't end. These things, they don't just hunt, they don't just kill, they linger. Watching. Waiting. For what? Elena pressed, her voice sharp with frustration. What do they want? You keep saying they study us, that they're intelligent, but what's the point? Why kill livestock? Why scare people? Why not just... She trailed off, unable to articulate the terrible thought forming in her mind. Take us. Mateo finished for her, his gaze dark and knowing. He shook his head. I don't know. Maybe they don't want to. Maybe we're the ones who keep stumbling into their world, not the other way around. Elena frowned. That doesn't make sense. This isn't some ghost story. These things leave marks on the animals on the windows. They're physical, tangible. And so is fear, Mateo said, his voice laced with bitterness. And fear is what they feed on. It's what draws them out. The more you know about them, the closer they get. You felt it back there, didn't you? That sense that they were waiting for you? Elena's stomach churned. She didn't want to admit it, but he was right. From the moment she'd arrived in San Mirasol, there had been an oppressive weight, a feeling that something was always watching. It had only grown stronger with each step of her investigation, culminating in the horrifying encounter at the church. Then why tell me all this? She asked, her frustration boiling over. If knowing makes it worse, why call me in the first place? Mateo sighed, leaning back against the seat. Because you were already in too deep. You were asking questions, poking at things better left alone. They already noticed you. Ignoring it wouldn't have saved you. Elena pressed her lips into a thin line, her mind racing. He was right. She couldn't turn back now. But she wasn't ready to give in to fear either. Somewhere in this chaos, there had to be answers. A reason. A way to fight back. As they crested a hill, the town of San Mirasol came into view, its quiet streets bathed in the soft glow of morning. Elena slowed the car, her exhaustion finally catching up with her. But as they entered the outskirts, she noticed something that sent a fresh wave of dread coursing through her veins. The streets were deserted, more than usual. No ranchers tending to their fields, no shopkeepers opening their doors. Even the stray dogs that usually roam the dusty alleys were nowhere to be seen. They're hiding, Mateo said quietly, reading her expression. They know what's coming. Elena parked in front of the inn, her hands trembling slightly as she turned off the engine. She glanced at Mateo, her voice barely above a whisper. Do they know we brought it with us? He didn't answer. He didn't have to. The air outside the car felt heavier than before, the morning light failing to chase away the oppressive sense of danger. Whatever the creatures were, wherever they came from, they weren't done. Not yet. Elena stepped out of the car, the oppressive silence swallowing the crunch of her boots on the gravel. The town of San Mirasol felt wrong, like a painting with the life drained out of it. The sun hung low on the horizon, but its light did little to dispel the shadows pooling in the narrow streets. Mateo followed her, his revolver now tucked into his belt, his eyes scanning every corner like a predator expecting a fight. Do they usually come this close to town? Elena asked, her voice hushed as if afraid to disturb the eerie quiet. No, Mateo replied curtly, his gaze fixed on the far end of the street. Not unless something has stirred them up. And we've done plenty of stirring. The words hung heavy in the air. Elena's stomach twisted with guilt, though she pushed it aside. She hadn't come here to feel sorry for herself. There was a story to uncover, a truth hidden in the fear that gripped this place. They approached the inn, its shuttered windows and locked door a stark contrast to the welcoming front Elena had seen when she first arrived. She tried the door handle, but it didn't budge. Mateo stepped forward, knocking sharply. Senora Alvarez, it's Mateo, he called out, his voice cutting through the stillness. Open up. We need to talk. There was no response. Elena felt the unease in her chest grow. She glanced down the street, half expecting to see the glowing eyes of the creatures emerging from the shadows. Instead, the emptiness seemed to stretch endlessly, the town holding its breath. They're not going to answer, she said finally. They're too scared. Mateo cursed under his breath. They should be. Elena hesitated. So what now? We can't just sit here and wait for them to come back. Mateo turned to her, his expression grim. We won't have to wait long." Before she could respond, a low rumble reached her ears, distant but unmistakable. It wasn't mechanical, nor was it the wind. It was the guttural, primal growl she had come to dread, echoing from somewhere beyond the town's edge. Mateo stiffened, his hand instinctively moving to his revolver. "They're here," he said simply. Elena's chest tightened as the growl grew louder, joined by others in an unholy chorus. The sound seemed to come from everywhere at once, reverberating off the buildings and rattling the shutters. She backed toward the car, her flashlight still clutched in her hand. "Do we run?" she asked, her voice tight with panic. Mateo shook his head. "No point. They'll follow. They always do." The growling intensified, and then she saw it. Movement at the edge of the main street, a shifting darkness that defied the morning light. The creatures were emerging, one by one, their forms contorting and blending with the shadows as they moved. Their glowing eyes fixed on her and Mateo, unblinking, predatory. "We need to hold them off," Mateo said, his voice steady but urgent. "Get inside somewhere, keep the light on them. It's the only way." Elena's pulse raced as she scanned the street. Every door was locked, every window shuttered. The townsfolk had barricaded themselves in, leaving her and Mateo exposed. The creatures were advancing now, their movements slow but deliberate, as if savoring the hunt. "Come on," Mateo barked, grabbing her arm and pulling her toward the inside alley. They sprinted, their footsteps echoing against the buildings. The growls followed, closer with every step, until Elena could swear she felt the heat of the creature's breath on her neck. They reached the back of the inn, where an old delivery door hung slightly ajar. Mateo shoved it open, and they slipped inside, slamming it shut behind them. The space was dark and cluttered, filled with broken furniture and forgotten supplies. Elena fumbled for her flashlight, its beam slicing through the gloom. The growling stopped, replaced by an eerie silence. Mateo held up a hand, signaling her to stay quiet. They listened, their breaths shallow as the tension mounted. Then came the sound of claws scraping against wood, slow and deliberate, just outside the door. "They're testing us," Mateo whispered. "Seeing how far they can push before we break." Elena felt her fear harden into resolve. "Then let's make sure we don't." The sound of claws dragging across the wood was relentless, a slow, deliberate scrape that made Elena's skin crawl. She tightened her grip on the flashlight, the weight of it comforting but wholly insufficient against what waited outside. Mateo leaned against the door, revolver in hand, his jaw clenched as he listened intently to the movement on the other side. "They know we're in here," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "They're waiting for us to make a mistake." Elena swallowed hard, her breath shaky as she tried to keep calm. "What do? We can't stay in here forever." Mateo glanced around the dimly lit room, his eyes searching for anything that could give them an advantage. The space was a storeroom filled with broken chairs, rusted tools, and dusty crates. Nothing that screamed salvation. Still, he began stacking some of the heavier items in front of the door, creating a makeshift barricade. "We hold them off until daylight," he said firmly. "They don't like the sun. It won't stop them entirely, but it'll slow them down." Elena frowned, her mind racing. "And then what? They'll just wait until nightfall again. This isn't sustainable." Mateo didn't answer immediately. Instead, he tested the barricade, pressing against it to ensure it would hold. "You wanted answers, right? You're not leaving this place without them." Her frustration bubbled to the surface, but she pushed it down. He was right. Running wouldn't solve anything. She turned her focus to the room, hoping for inspiration. Her flashlight beam fell on a crate in the corner, its lid partially pried open. Inside were glass bottles filled with liquid that gleamed faintly in the dim light. "What's this?" she asked, approaching the crate and pulling one of the bottles free. Mateo turned to look, his brow furrowing. "Alcohol, probably from the inn's bar." Elena's mind worked quickly, as to have the pieces falling into place. If they hate light, maybe they hate fire too. Mateo's eyes narrowed as he caught on. "You're thinking Molotovs?" She nodded, already digging through her bag for a piece of cloth. "It's not much, but it might buy us time." Mateo gave a tight-lipped nod. "It's a good idea. Just make sure you don't set us on fire instead." Elena smirked, despite herself, the tension easing slightly as she prepared the makeshift weapons. She handed one to Mateo, and he tested its weight before tucking it into his belt. They worked in silence, the sound of claws and guttural growls continuing outside like a grim soundtrack to their efforts. When they had 3 bottles ready, Mateo stepped back to the door, his revolver in one hand and a Molotov in the other. "We're going to have to draw them out, make them come into the open." Elena's heart pounded as she nodded. "And then we light them up." The plan was thin, risky, and desperate, but it was all they had. Mateo pulled the barricade back just enough to open the door a crack. The growling immediately intensified, the sound of the creatures pressing against the door sending a chill down Elena's spine. Mateo struck a match, lighting the cloth wick of his Molotov. The flickering flame danced in the gloom, illuminating his determined expression. "When I throw this, run for the front door. Get ready to light yours if they follow." Elena braced herself, gripping her bottle tightly. The air seemed to vibrate with tension, every second stretching into an eternity. Mateo took a deep breath, then flung the door open wide and hurled the flaming bottle into the darkness. The explosion of fire lit up the alleyway, illuminating the twisted forms of the creatures as they scattered, their snarls turning into shrieks of anger and pain. Elena bolted for the front of the inn, Mateo close behind her. The heat from the flames brushed against her as she sprinted, but she didn't dare look back. Reaching the front door, she turned and lit her own Molotov, the fire's glow steady in her trembling hands. The creatures were regrouping, their glowing eyes fixed on her and Mateo with unrelenting fury. "Now or never," she whispered, and as the first creature lunged, she let the bottle fly. The Molotov arced through the air, its flame casting jagged, flickering shadows across the alley before it shattered against the cobblestones. Fire erupted in a bright, violent flash, consuming the creature mid-lunge. Its shriek pierced the air, an unearthly sound that rattled Elena to her core. The flames illuminated its grotesque form, its elongated limbs and mottled hide writhing as the fire consumed it. The other creatures recoiled, hissing and snarling as they shrank back into the shadows. "Move," Mateo barked, snapping Elena out of her trance. He grabbed her arm, pulling her toward the car parked a short distance away. The adrenaline surged through her again as they sprinted, her heartbeat deafening in her ears. Behind them, the creatures regrouped, their growls rising in a cacophony of rage. They moved faster now, emboldened by their numbers despite the firelight that licked at the edges of the alley. Reaching the car, Elena fumbled with the keys, her hands slick with sweat and shaking from the chaos. Mateo spun around, his revolver raised, and fired a shot into the darkness. The muzzle flash briefly illuminated one of the creatures, its glowing eyes locked onto them with a terrifying intensity. It flinched at the sound, but kept advancing. "Now, Reyes!" Mateo yelled, firing again. The engine roared to life as Elena turned the key, her knuckles white against the steering wheel. Mateo barely had time to throw himself into the passenger seat before she slammed her foot on the gas. The tires screeched and the car shot forward, the headlights carving a path through the gloom. In the rearview mirror, she saw the creatures giving chase, their forms flickering in and out of view like living shadows. They moved with unnatural speed, their limbs bending and twisting in ways that defied logic. The road ahead blurred as Elena focused on one goal: escape. "They're not giving up," she said, her voice trembling with equal parts fear and anger. "What the hell do we do now?" Mateo leaned out of the window, his revolver aimed at the closest creature. He fired twice, but the bullet seemed to have little effect beyond slowing it momentarily. He ducked back inside, his face grim. "They're faster than I thought." The road twisted as they approached the edge of town, the hills rising like dark sentinels against the horizon. Elena gritted her teeth, her mind racing. Fire had worked to scare them off, but they were relentless, intelligent, and seemingly tireless. There had to be a way to stop them, or at least buy enough time to figure out what they were dealing with. "Up ahead," Mateo said suddenly, pointing toward a narrow dirt road that branched off into the hills. "Take that path. There's a ravine about a mile out. It's steep, too steep for them to follow." Elena hesitated for a split second before jerking the wheel, the car skidding onto the dirt road. The uneven terrain made the vehicle lurch and bounce, and the sound of claws scraping against metal told her how close the creatures were. One of them leapt, slamming against the trunk of the car. The impact sent a jolt through her, but she kept driving, refusing to slow down. "Hold on," Matteo yelled, lighting another Molotov. He leaned out of the window again, this time hurling the flaming bottle toward the road behind them. The explosion of fire lit up the dark landscape, scattering the creatures momentarily and giving the car a precious few seconds of distance. The ravine came into view just as the sun began to crest over the hills, its golden light spreading like a shield against the night. Elena pushed the car harder, the engine roaring as they neared the edge. The creatures hesitated, their forms shrinking back as the first rays of sunlight touched them. "Keep going," Matteo urged. "The light will slow them down." Elena didn't need to be told twice. She kept driving, the car barreling toward the ravine, as the creatures melted into the shadows, their growls fading into the rising dawn. When the car finally skidded to a stop at the edge, she collapsed against the steering wheel, her breaths coming in ragged gasps. Beside her, Matteo exhaled deeply, his revolver still in hand. The silence was deafening, broken only by the soft hum of the engine and the distant rustle of the morning breeze. "They'll be back," Matteo said finally, his voice heavy with exhaustion. "They always come back." Elena nodded, staring out at the ravine below. The sunlight felt like a fragile shield, temporary and fleeting. Whatever they had faced, it wasn't over. Not yet, and she was beginning to realize it might never be. The car sat idling at the edge of the ravine, the soft hum of the engine the only sound breaking the morning stillness. Elena wiped a shaky hand across her face, her skin slick with sweat and grime. The sun was higher now, its light stretching across the jagged terrain, but it felt fragile, like a temporary reprieve rather than a true salvation. Beside her, Matteo stared out at the horizon, his revolver resting on his thigh, its barrel blackened from repeated use. "They're smart," he said finally, breaking the silence. "Too smart. They won't come at us while the sun's up, but they'll be watching, waiting." Elena swallowed hard, her throat dry. "And when the sun goes down again?" Matteo didn't answer immediately. Instead, he turned to her, his expression hard but not unkind. "You came here for answers. If we're going to have any chance of surviving this, we need to find them. Fast." She nodded, gripping the steering wheel. "Where do we start? The church is gone, the town's locked up tight, and you said these things don't just kill, they learn. So, what's their end game?" Matteo ran a hand over his face, his exhaustion evident. "I don't know if they have one," he admitted, "but there's someone who might, an old man, Hector, lives up in the hills. People around here call him El Sabio, the wise one. He's seen things even I can't explain." Elena's brows furrowed. "Why didn't we go to him before?" "Because he doesn't talk to strangers. Hell, he barely talks to anyone. But after what we've just been through, he might make an exception." Matteo paused, then added, "If he's still alive." The weight of his words settled heavily between them. Elena glanced at the ravine, its jagged edges stretching out like a maw. The creatures were out there somewhere, waiting in the shadows, their glowing eyes likely watching even now. She tightened her grip on the wheel, her resolve hardening. "Then we go now," she said, before they get the chance to regroup. The drive to the hills was tense and silent. The dirt road winding through barren stretches of land, dotted with gnarled trees and scattered rocks. The sun climbed higher, its light bleaching the landscape and casting sharp, angular shadows. Elena kept glancing at the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the creatures bounding after them, but the road remained empty. After nearly an hour, they reached a small, weathered cabin perched precariously on the edge of a steep incline. Smoke curled lazily from the chimney, and an ancient truck sat rusting in the yard, its tires flat and its body covered in dents. Matteo gestured for her to stop, and they climbed out of the car. The cabin's door creaked open before they could knock, and a wiry old man stepped out, his face etched with deep lines that spoke of a lifetime of hardship. His eyes were sharp and piercing, taking them both in with a single glance. He carried a walking stick that looked more like a weapon, its surface carved with intricate symbols. "Hector," Matteo said, his tone respectful. "We need your help." Hector snorted, his gaze lingering on Elena. "Help?" he said, his voice gravely but firm. "You think anyone can help with what's out there?" Elena stepped forward, her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her insides. "We don't have a choice. Those things, they're hunting us. They're hunting this town. If you know anything at all, we need to hear it." Hector studied her for a long moment, then turned and motioned for them to follow him inside. The cabin's interior was cluttered but surprisingly organized, filled with books, jars of herbs, and strange artifacts that looked both ancient and otherworldly. A map of the region was pinned to one wall, marked with red X's in places that sent a shiver down Elena's spine. "You've already seen them, haven't you?" Hector asked, settling into a worn chair and gesturing for them to sit. "The shadows that move when they shouldn't, the eyes that burn in the dark. You felt them." Elena nodded, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. "What are they?" Hector leaned back, his expression unreadable. "That depends on what you believe," he said. "Some say they're demons, cursed to wander this earth. Others think they're something older, from a time when humans weren't the only ones who walked these lands." Mateo leaned forward, his voice tense. "And you? What do you think?" Hector's eyes narrowed. "I think they're here to remind us that some things are better left in the dark." Hector's words hung in the air like a cloud of smoke, heavy and suffocating. Elena shifted uneasily in her chair, her fingers brushing against the edge of the table as if grounding herself. Mateo, sitting rigid beside her, looked like he was weighing every word Hector had said. The old man's cabin was eerily quiet, save for the occasional creak of the wind pressing against the wooden walls. "You said some things are better left in the dark," Elena pressed, her voice steady despite the weight in her chest. "But they're not staying there, are they?" "They're hunting us, killing. If there's something you know, something we can use, you need to tell us." Hector gave a dry chuckle, the sound as rough as gravel. "You think knowledge is a weapon?" He shook his head, leaning forward so that the light from the small, flickering lantern caught the deep lines of his face. "What you're dealing with isn't something you fight. Not with guns, not with fire, not with anything you can carry." "Then what do we do?" Mateo asked, his voice sharp with frustration. "Just sit back and let them tear us apart?" Hector's piercing eyes locked onto Mateo's. "You survive. You learn their rules. They have them, even if they seem like chaos to us. The moment you understand their boundaries, you figure out how to live on the edge of them. Not inside, not outside, just barely in their blind spots." Elena frowned, her frustration bubbling to the surface. "That's not an answer. We can't just coexist with them. Not after what we've seen." Hector regarded her for a long moment, then rose from his chair. He crossed the room, pulling a weathered book from a shelf. Its leather cover was cracked, and the pages looked as though they might crumble if touched. He placed it on the table between them, tapping its surface. "This," he said, "is what I've gathered in my years watching them. Patterns, signs, their comings and goings. It's not much, but it's enough to keep them at bay, for now." Elena opened the book carefully, her eyes scanning the strange symbols and hastily scribbled notes. Some pages were maps marked with intricate patterns, others filled with accounts of encounters, descriptions of the creatures and their behavior. It was a patchwork of fear and observation, a lifeline stitched together by someone desperate to make sense of the senseless. "You've been keeping them away from here," Mateo said, his voice soft with realization. "That's why they don't come this far into the hills." Hector nodded. "They respect boundaries. As long as I stay out of theirs, they stay out of mine. But you..." He looked at Elena, his gaze sharp. "You've already crossed into their territory. You've seen them, felt their attention. They won't forget that." Elena swallowed hard. "So what now? Do we just keep running?" Hector sighed, sitting back in his chair. "Running won't save you, but understanding might." He pointed to the book. "Take it. Learn from it. Maybe you'll find something I missed, or maybe you'll just delay the inevitable." Mateo glanced at the book, then at Hector. "What about the town? The people there, they're already scared out of their minds. They won't survive another attack." Hector's face darkened. "They made their choice a long time ago. They stopped listening, stopped believing. That's why the creatures are back. Fear brings them, but disbelief keeps them here." Elena closed the book, her resolve hardening. "Then we'll make them listen. We'll figure out how to stop this." Hector smiled faintly, though it didn't reach his eyes. "You're brave," he said. "Braver than most. But bravery doesn't always save you." The sound of rustling outside the cabin made them all freeze. Hector stood slowly, his hand tightening on his walking stick as he moved toward the window. The first rays of afternoon light filtered through the cracks, but they didn't bring comfort. Instead, they cast long, creeping shadows. "They're testing us," Hector murmured, peering outside. "They know you're here." Elena stood, the book clutched tightly in her hands. The weight of its knowledge felt heavier than anything she'd ever carried. And for the first time, she wondered if it might be a burden she wouldn't survive. The rustling outside grew louder, more deliberate, like the creatures were no longer bothering to hide their presence. Hector's weathered face remained stoic as he stepped away from the window, his hands still clutching the carved walking stick. Mateo rose from his chair, his revolver in hand, though the exhaustion in his eyes betrayed his dwindling confidence. "They're not waiting anymore," Hector said, his voice low. "They've decided it's time." Elena's grip on the weathered book tightened. The weight of its fragile pages, filled with decades of observations and desperate survival tactics, now felt like her only tether to hope. She glanced at Mateo, who gave her a slight nod, and then back at Hector. "What do we do?" Hector's gaze was sharp, unflinching. "You leave. You take that book, and you get as far from this place as you can. It's not just San Mirasol they're after anymore. It's you. You've seen too much. You've become a part of their hunt." "No," Mateo said firmly. "We're not leaving you behind." Hector smiled faintly, a bitter curve of his lips. "You don't have a choice. They'll come for all of us if you stay, but if you go, you might draw them away. Give the town a chance." Elena opened her mouth to argue, but the sound of claws scraping against the cabin walls made her words die in her throat. The creatures were close now, circling like wolves around a wounded prey. The thin walls of the cabin seemed like no protection at all, just a flimsy barrier delaying the inevitable. Hector moved to a small chest in the corner of the room, opening it with deliberate care. From inside, he pulled a bundle of fabric, unwrapping it to reveal a curved blade, its surface etched with the same symbols that adorned his walking stick. "This is their language," he said, holding the blade up to the light. "Or something close to it. They recognize it. Fear it, maybe. But it's not enough to stop them, just to slow them down." Mateo stepped forward, his jaw tight. "Then let's use it." Hector shook his head, pressing the blade into Mateo's hand. "You'll need it more than I will. They've already marked you both. If you survive, use this to protect yourselves." Elena's chest tightened as the reality of the situation settled over her. Hector wasn't coming with them. He had made his peace with whatever fate awaited him, and she knew there was no time to convince him otherwise. The scraping turned to pounding, the creatures testing the strength of the door. The cabin creaked and groaned under the weight of their assault. Hector turned to Elena and Mateo, his eyes fierce. "Go now. I'll buy you what time I can." Mateo hesitated, his hand gripping the blade so tightly his knuckles turned white. But Elena grabbed his arm, pulling him toward the door on the opposite side of the cabin, the one that led deeper into the hills. "We have to go." The pounding intensified as they slipped outside, the morning light already fading under the heavy clouds that rolled in like an omen. They ran, the book clutched tightly to Elena's chest, the sound of the creatures tearing into the cabin behind them, spurring her legs to move faster than she thought possible. When they crested the first hill, she turned back, her breath catching in her throat. The cabin was ablaze, fire licking at its roof, the shadows of the creatures writhing in the inferno. And amidst it all, Hector stood in the doorway, his walking stick raised like a shield. Then he was gone, swallowed by the flames. Tears blurred Elena's vision, but she kept running, Mateo by her side. The book weighed her down, its contents an unbearable reminder of the price Hector had paid. But it also held the only hope they had left, a chance to understand, to fight back, to survive. As they disappeared into the hills, the first notes of a guttural growl echoed behind them. The hunt wasn't over, it had only just begun.